Hey, what is going on, guys? In today's video, we're going to be doing a settings guide for video and general settings in Fortnite Season 7. I've already made a guide on controller settings and sensitivity and bindings if you're curious, but for this video, we're just going to be focusing on your graphics settings and your general settings, which may include a couple controller settings like aim assist, edit mode aim assist, but we're not talking about sensitivity today. Okay, let's get right into it. Window mode. I run window full screen because it's easier to switch between windows. The one problem with this is that if you want to use a set res command, set a stretch resolution within the game, so not a global setting, but within the game, this will not work. You have to use full screen, so just keep that in mind. Display resolution, I recommend you keep this to your native screen resolution. The reason why I say this, unless you're running a stretched of course, the reason why I say this is because if you're having FPS problems, you can always lower your 3D resolution, but this right here is going to affect your UI resolution. And UI does not take a whole lot to run. It's just going to make the game look a lot nicer. So I really don't see a reason to lower this. And also, if you try to put like 1080p to 1440, that doesn't scale perfectly. So it's just creating issues that you don't need to have. If you're having FPS issues, look at the 3D resolution or your graphics settings, not really your display resolution. Frame rate limit, at least set this to your monitor's refresh rate. You definitely can get better input latency if you set it higher. When I had to run on a 60 Hz monitor for a little while, 60 FPS frame rate limit was almost unbearable, but 120 felt much better. But at 144, if I crank it to 240, it's not really that noticeable. So at least set it to your monitor's refresh rate. You could consider going higher, but if you just want to make the game more consistent, it could be worth capping it to your monitor refresh rate. And then a lot of demanding scenes like, tilted towers, build battles, you may not even reach, your monitor refresh rate anyway. So this is going to be irrelevant in the situations where FPS matters most anyway. So just keep that in mind. We're talking about 3D resolution. You can lower this if you're having FPS problems, but a lot of you are probably going to be bound by your CPU. So this actually probably won't help as much as you think it would, but it could be something worth trying. It's easy to turn it down and turn it back up. So you could try it if you're having issues. Okay, view distance, I highly recommend you have on Epic if your PC can run it, and let me explain why. This may not necessarily help you see enemies further, but it'll load in buildings and terrain faster. And that's really important because say we're going to fly over tilted towers, right? If you have view distance on Epic, you might see the entirety of the hotel buildings when blown up and is straight up gone. Well, that means you're now going to know there was a big fight there. Someone probably dynamited that whole building, right? But if you're on near view distance, you have to get a lot closer to see that render in. So I would recommend you have it on Epic if possible. Shadows, I highly recommend you have that off. The reason why is because if you have shadows on, you're just making it easier for enemies to hide in little corners and nooks and crannies in the map, right? So that's not really a good setting to have. So I would recommend you keep these off. Alright, anti-aliasing, textures, effects, post-processing. Honestly, these settings are not the biggest deal. I keep them off because that's just the most conventional competitive settings. But if you want to turn them on to make your game look nicer, I don't think it's the biggest deal. It's not like shadows where you're going to make yourself at a big competitive disadvantage. You get textures on max, not the biggest deal. So that's really more up to you. I'm not going to make a hard stance on this. VSync I would recommend you have off though. Yes, VSync may help your computer and screen sync up, but the game even mentions it. You might be introducing input latency, so not something I would recommend. Motion blur I don't recommend either because what you're doing there is you're making the game blurry. Why would you want to make your enemies blurry? Not recommended. I don't use that. Let's move on to general settings. Starting with toggle sprint, this is a redundant setting because you need to have sprint by default on. If you don't have sprint by default on, I highly recommend you reconsider. There's almost zero situations where walking is better than sprinting. So if you just have sprint by default all the time, you just remove that disadvantage. And because of that, toggle sprint would be redundant. So sprint by default, you need to have on. Absolutely. Toggle sprint is irrelevant. Sprint cancels reloading. I don't recommend this one. If you have sprint by default on, you can create complications with making it difficult to reload. If you need to cancel a reload, you can always cycle your pickaxe or cycle to your shields and back. So you don't need the setting. I recommend it off. Tap to search I recommend on. That's just reducing the number of mistakes you can make because you just press the button once to open a chest and it's open. You don't have to hold it. If you release too early, if you have this off, you could mess it up. So I don't see a reason to have this off because it just reduces the number of, I guess, mistakes you can make. Toggle targeting, I don't see a problem with that setting, but I know like nobody that uses this, so you could use it, but it's unconventional. Preset building choice, back in the day, like a long time ago, this was like a mandatory setting, but nowadays it really doesn't matter. Because of Builder Pro Build Immediately, at mouse and keyboard, you basically have the equivalent of Builder Pro Build Immediately. Like, it doesn't matter because you're just gonna, it's one click to place a build. So this is kind of irrelevant. So I keep it on because it's best to have a default to the wall piece. For controller, just so you can see. And keyboard, this literally doesn't matter at all because you're pressing, like, say, I don't know, mouse button for wall and mouse button for stair, right? So this is literally irrelevant for you. But for controller, it's also nearly irrelevant. I just keep it on just because, but not the biggest deal. Aim assist you need to have on. There's not really a discussion to have there. Edit mode aim assist, though, that is a more interesting conversation. I feel like for walls, floors, and cones, it is quite a helpful setting to keep you in the boxes. And especially if you're new to the game, could be something worth trying. But with stairs, it's just incredibly clunky because there's that middle piece in the stairs that's not an editable like square. And when you have to roll over that to rotate your stair, you get stuck and you have to fight it, and it's frustrating. So for that reason, I don't use it, but it could be something worth trying. Turbo build, you need to have that on. Turbo delete and creative, sure. Auto material change, you need to have that on. There's not advantage having it off. Auto run, up to you. Auto open doors can be nice because if you make a mistake and edit a door, you can instantly open that. So could be something worth trying. For me, I'm not saying I'm the greatest editor. I make a ton of mistakes, but I very rarely tend to accidentally edit doors. And this can make door fighting and like tilted towers very frustrating because if you're trying to use the door as a piece of cover and it keeps opening it, that can be frustrating. So I actually would say probably have this off. But if you're editing and you're making a lot of doors on accident, could be worth something worth having. Auto pickup weapons. This actually got fixed recently. For a long time, auto pickup weapons would keep trying to pick up stuff even though your inventory was full, creating this infinite loop. But now that seems to have been fixed. So this can actually be useful for off the drop getting that gun before your enemy. So maybe something worth trying, but it's also not a super important mandatory setting either. Auto sort consumables to the right, that's preference, but I think most of you will like that because most of you are going to put them to the far right. Builder Pro Build Immediately, that's a mandatory setting. And control edit time, this should be redundant because you should have an instant edit button. If you don't have an instant edit button, even if you play with no claw, no paddles, please do have an instant edit button. Because holding a button for any essential action like that is just a terrible idea. You're introducing 200 milliseconds of delay in your inputs. That's just not a good thing to be having. Vibration, don't recommend that. It's not really any advantages, but only possible disadvantage. And finally, NVIDIA highlights and record replays, up to you. Could slightly reduce your FPS, but not the biggest deal. So, I hope this helps you, and I will catch you in the next video.